Ethiopia is unique for several reasons. The first being that they have lots of written books, some that have not been translated to this day. Not only does this make this unique, but it also makes it a very religious thing. It's one of the few places outside of Egypt where the people who live outside of Africa try to take claim of that land and try to take claim of its civilization as well. Its prehistory period ends very early compared to the rest of Africa. And there are stories written about civilizing missions done by Ethiopian kings, but yet the tribes of Ethiopia still remain to this day, being able to choose their own chiefs and be independent and not be forced to learn to read or write or any of these other things that would come later. It is a strange story that Ethiopia has gone through, and it actually is a very relatable thing considering how much the rest of Africa has held on. Ethiopia didn't just live in the memories of the Ethiopians, but it lives in the memories of many people around the world who wrote about it. And that's what makes it very different for me. The fact that its reputation is very, very big. Now, of course, most of the time, Ethiopia is written as Abyssinia, as Ethiopia, even as late as the 16 and 1700s, referred to Sudan and that area. Now, mistaken identity is not something that is unique for Ethiopia, as in the Zanj rebellion that would happen during the time of Al Masudi and all the other Islamic writers. The Abyssinians, which are referred to by several scholars, will get into the names in another video, but these scholars, they write that one of the leaders was an Abyssinian man. And that's the interesting thing about Ethiopia, the fact that it is written about all over the world in a more detailed way than any other part of Africa. And at no point is the credit given to other civilizations or other people until later, of course, when they start to claim that Abyssinians are actually white. A hilarious assumption, considering the fact that the word Ethiopian is a word used by the Ethiopians themselves to describe themselves as early as the 4th century. And it's hilarious because the word Ethiopia literally means black people. But if you ever read some short Ethiopian manuscripts and some poems, or even the philosophers, the few of them that have been translated from Ethiopia, you get a different feeling than you get in almost every other place. In Africa, there's a bit of a sense of secularism in the scientific writings. So if you go to Timbuktu, if you go to the Swahili coast, and if you go to many of those places, you get the sense that those people know that the most religious times were in the times of Muhammad. And so you don't get too many claims of people flying or magic being done. Now, obviously, from the tribal point of view, you get a lot of those in terms of like their king can turn into a lion or anything like that. But from the Islamic point of view, they don't say anything close to that. Whereas the Ethiopians seem to think that they live still in biblical times. That is the interesting thing if you read the Cabernet Gas, is that you don't get this interpretation that the biblical times have happened and now they're living completely free of that specific era. Instead of getting this same interpretation that a lot of people have around the world, including the Islamic countries. For example, right, let's take, you know, the Middle East, right, Yemen and those places. The most important times for them is definitely in the time of Muhammad and things like that. And then from then on, you start getting secularism, you start getting all kinds of interpretations, and some stories here and there of magic and stuff being done during the time. But for the most part, they're focusing on scientific slash religious things, but never do they say that there is a more important time than the time of Muhammad. And in fact, to this day, there is some people who like to arc back to those very early days, saying that those people were practicing Islam the most perfect. Even if you look at the Judeo religion, as close as it is to what Ethiopia is, because they too do not believe they live in a completely historical time, but that they are connected to some degree to the religious time, but it's nowhere near what Ethiopians believed about their history. For example, in the Judeo religion, people like David, people like Solomon, Abraham, all these people, that is the actual time that is considered a religious opening, or the most religious time, where admittedly you start hearing stories that are fantastical more. But in Ethiopia, it's a little different. It seems like the eras that happen, the Cabernet Gas in a way is a sort of Bible that doesn't just document the history of what happened, but at the same time, it documents the feelings of these people, in my opinion, more uniquely than any other place in the world. Now, of course, we have parallels to this, and there's a reason why I'm saying it the way that I am. Like if we look at the Native Americans, they don't have a specific period where they go, this is the Christian period, and this period was when things were going well and we're religious, and then now we're living in that post period where we're just waiting. The kings of the most of the kingdoms in the Americas are not depicted as just being kings, but also religious figures. But not only are they depicted in this way, but they're depicted in their state underground, in their birth state, and all of these things, which show the comparison to the other world. That this is not something that is historical or any of that. Instead, it is something that is actively living. And it's actually a very difficult thing to explain now that I think about it. Imagine that you believed that your president had magical powers. And I don't mean that in a you think that guy's got magic, but you don't like him. I mean, you literally think that the guy is a deity. And then you think when the person dies that they're still all around you and that they are comforting the nation or anything like that. That is the reality of a lot of these kingdoms that existed, let's say, outside of the Islamic and Christian world. Whereas the Islamic and Christian world, they sort of have a time period where they group things down, and then the rest of it is just about being a good follower. It's just about being a good follower. So if you can be a good Christian, if you can be a good Muslim, if you can bring back, and in fact in Islam, they have someone whose sole job is to bring back the old understanding of Islam so you don't make up new information. And the Bible has got a part at the end that says, do not add to this book. But clearly, in Ethiopia, there is something very different going on. Not only is there more information, you don't need to go search in closed manuscripts, and it's not a reinterpretation of the olden days, but instead it is new information that is to be used now. The kings are seen as different, not just some beings that exist in a past past the most important period times. They actually live in a time where it's important now. It's things that are religious are happening now. Now, before obviously some people start to question this, I'm not saying that they are not prone or do not have typical religious or mythological thoughts in Europe and the Middle East and all these other places. They definitely did. Perhaps the most easy to spot inside of Europe at this time as a very, very far away thought. Like if you take what was happening at the time, actually physically what was happening, and then you take like a belief, like a thought that they thought that this was actually real. They put this in history books as well, is the depiction of elephants being the main enemy of dragons. Now, of course, elephants are probably not that common in Europe, so they're mythologized, and you can see that the elephant with the dragon is almost always depicted wrapped up, but still capable of fighting it off. This is probably because of the scale of the elephant being over exaggerated at the time. Now you're probably thinking, wasn't this guy talking about Ethiopia? Well, this is to make sure that you guys understand the difference that I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about mythological beliefs. I'm not just talking about misinterpretations. What the Ethiopians are seeing, what the Ethiopians are living, carrying specific pieces inside of Ethiopia that still hold powerful magic, and they come from the early days, but they're still around now. This is worlds apart from these types of belief. If everything they say is real, then Ethiopia, in my opinion, is the most Christian nation that has ever existed. Now, I want to finish with these dragons because it's very important. Now, remember that elephants are more common in what continent? Africa. And the depictions of elephants and dragons being in fights and stuff like that has little to do with Europe. And this is a bit of the difference, is that they're speaking of distant lands a lot of the time. I mean, they do say that they're dragons in Europe, but a lot of the time they're speaking of distant lands, and they're talking about places as far as Africa. Think about that as a thought, that Europeans actually thought that if they go to Africa, they're going to find actual dragons. And at one point, they thought they did when they found a certain type of salamander. But they thought they were going to find actual dragons having fights with elephants that are as big as buildings and can actually take down whole kingdoms by themselves. Imagine their disappointment when they realize that it's like an elephant can barely handle 6 or 7 people on its back without tipping them over. Now, of course, it does have the strength to hold that and hold a giant carrier on its back. And the depictions, of course, of elephants in the Middle East tell us what actually happens when you have a lot of experience with something in the elephant clock, of course, making the elephant extremely small compared to not only the thing it's carrying on its back, but the people themselves, and it being a slave to the human race rather than the other way around. Which brings me to this picture that comes from the Europeans of an elephant deep in Africa. These dragons, as you can see, are attacking the elephants in Zanzibar, in the Zand regions. What's interesting is that this does not come from a time late in its history, it comes from the 1600s. And so, why would this be included in a historical book in a context of history? And the real answer is they believe in dragons, and they believed that these dragons were actually going to be spotted and found. And so, as much as they conjectured, they thought that it was a educated guess. Now, you might be thinking, as far as the kings of Europe go, didn't a lot of those Christian kings claim to have divine rights to rule? Well, the difference between this and Ethiopia is that they didn't just claim to have divine right. They claimed to be a direct descendant of the God of God and the direct descendant of the Salamaic and all these people. They didn't claim that they were elected by God in the same way that a lot of other kingdoms did. In fact, the way that they did saw it was in almost the same way that the caliphs claimed to be related to Muhammad. The only difference, of course, is that Muhammad is seen even lesser as just a prophet, whereas these people are claiming to be directly descended from God in a way that other people are not. There is a word that is very unique in the Ethiopian language, which means prophecy. And this word that is used constantly in ancient texts talks firstly in very biblical terms and then in ways that are not necessarily in the Bible, but it has quotes, even though they're not necessarily from the Bible themselves, that speak of the later years, the people who are to come. So, a mythologized character that we all know from Ethiopia is Menelik the First. Menelik the First is the son of the Queen of Sheba, and he is a very important historical figure. And I kind of want to save his narrative for another video because his story is tied to the history of Ethiopia. And I think that's something that I need to do because I've been trying to avoid that for a long time, where the history of Congo, for example, has a different history than the one that is told today mythologically. So the people of Congo themselves have a religious history, even with their Christianity, that is told from a completely different perspective than what is told today, where they secularize everything. They try to bring everything to a understanding, a normal understanding. But in the past, it was all connected to religion. There is no Kingdom of Congo without a religious perspective. And in the same way, there is no Ethiopia without a religious perspective. And I don't mean that in a very small way again. I mean that in a very large way. I would love to just start rattling a bunch of names off, but some of these names I can see, but from reading in detail the Cabernet Gas, that they are completely ignored by most people. You don't even find these characters on Wikipedia or anything like that. They're just one-offs that go through the entire book. They don't. It's not like their names appear once or twice in the book. They go through the entire book, and one of them is Micah, the prophet, and it is unique to me. It is something that I find very strange to me that such a detailed history has never been told in another way or told in a historical documentary or something to sort of put it in a nice, neat subject or nice, neat way that is not going to require too much reading and is going to trim the fat. So that's what I'm going to try to do. But, it would have been way better if it already existed, especially with all the effects that Hollywood or any of these places could come up with. They take little chunks, of course, like the Ark of the Covenant and stuff like that, and throw it in there as if that is the final say of this Ethiopian kingdom. And of course, we must remember still that this period is still not the earliest writings in Ethiopia. This would just be a second time of Ethiopia. We still have the land of Punt, which, of course, they like to talk about as if it's like a place where it was a curiosity for the Egyptians, but it was not a mere curiosity. It was a very important place. And in between this period, between the ancient Egyptians and the modern world, there is a lot that is left over, of course, from the Egyptian period as well, that we can see traces of Egyptianness. Which brings me to Zara Yacob. Zara Yacob is again another Ethiopian king that is written about a lot, and I mentioned him a little bit in when I was talking about the kings of the 1400s, and I said that he's one of the greatest rulers of that time. Of course, great meaning he ruled with conviction, and he ruled making sure that what he considered good would prevail, which was Christianity, obviously, but the way that he did this was persecuting other religions. But first, let me explain something very quickly. He persecuted non Christians. There is a big difference between Zara Yacob, the king, and Zara Yacob, the philosopher, which we will get into another time because, again, he is well written about. His philosophies are understood even in the Western world. There are translations made, which some people assume were made up by Europeans at the time to try and give a certain spin on the philosophies of Zara Yacob. But let's go back to Zara Yacob, the king. So, as I've mentioned in other videos, paganism was still very common in Ethiopia by the time of Zara Yacob. And not only was it typical, it was a competing religion with the Christian faith. It even existed within the royal family itself, leading to Zara Yacob in a paranoid rage, getting rid of his own son and wife. Things got so bad that people started accusing other people whenever they wanted a person to be removed from the royal houses or any important position. They would simply accuse them of being a pagan, knowing that his obsession with getting rid of non Christians, pagans, would end up attacking these certain types of people. And in one case, he wrongfully attacked people because of a judgment, but when it was found out that this was wrong, the culprits were dealt with. Now, again, this is the part that is difficult about Ethiopia, which is why would a place that is so deep in Christianity, why is it with a place that is so deep within Judaism, why would it still have paganism within its ranks? And the answer is because paganism was as alive in those places as the Christianity itself. And a lot of the writings depict this. A lot of the writings that still exist, they show this. I mean, there was a BBC video that I showed about it where they literally are talking about how these Ethiopians were talking about, okay, you put this bandana on, you write this, and you can fly. This is the importance of it. Ethiopia never really lost its tie to Africa. And even in later years after Zara Yacob, you still see deep ties within the African religion. And remember, the Tsar religion still exists. And this Tsar religion, and this is why I brought up Egypt, is tied to Egypt. It's tied to Persia. It's tied to all these other places because of movement as well. This African religion, the Tsar religion, spread. Now, I would love to just skip the story of Zara Yacob and talk about it in a different time, perhaps with illustrations, because it is a very detailed story of spies and things like that. And again, I don't know why it hasn't been told before in a very specific way. Of course, it has been in Ethiopia, but yeah, I don't speak Ethiopian, so I mean, to me, this is fascinating because the land of Punt, the Egyptians saw that there was something special about this place, and it has proven itself spectacularly over the years. Even today, I mean, being one of the few places in the world, in Africa, never to be colonized, and even when it was colonized, even when other places of Africa were colonized, they showed that there was something completely special about them too. This is why I respect Ethiopia and I have a hard time making videos about Ethiopia, because there's always 1,000 shoots to shoot down, 1,000 areas, slides to go through, links to go through, rather than one unified story